Man, why is my DPS so shit? I followed the guide, checked the talents, gear, covenants, rotations, legendaries, and more! And still shit! Why?
Well, you, my friend, sound like you need to analyze your logs to dive deeper into your performance.
Hey man, analyze this.
Hey man, do you want more damage or not? Because if you do, you gotta learn what parses are, the timeline of your cooldowns, and all of that good stuff just to see the...
This is bullshit!
Well, this is how you get good, fool!
Man, is this what you were doing instead of losing your virginity?
Hey, you want more damage or not?
Well, I cannot buy more DPS, can I? Ding, 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 ding. Ding, 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 ding.
It's the motherfucking M-O-double-G.
Ding, ding, ding.
Something else that you don't have to buy is our love. No, really, you do have to buy with a like and subscribe and enable those notifications. Listen, you might think that we're actually selling out, and you are correct, because liking, subscribing, and enabling those notifications does help push the video out to more and more people, and that's just great for everybody because we don't usually do these kinds of videos, and if you're not enabling all of the notifications, you might not even get these types of videos because they're not, you know, part of the normal plan. But enjoy. Once you have understood the basics of your spec, it's time to push it to the next level, and that is logging. Logs are basically a collection of data that encompasses everything you do and everything everyone in your group does in a raid boss fight or during a dungeon run. Yes, logs are good for Mythic Plus as well, and you should use them. By looking at logs, you can start to pinpoint things that you are doing wrong and start working on improving your rotation and the general execution of your spec. First things first, you need to go to www.warcraftlogs.com. Top right, you will see the sign up button, which will take you through the account creation section. That should be pretty straightforward. Once you have followed all the instructions on creating your account, you will sign in and install the desktop client. This will let you physically upload your local logs from playing the game to the Warcraft logs database, where you can essentially show them to other people and, you know, analyze them. They have released a companion app recently, but we will leave that for another time. Once you have the client installed, you need to go into your game and open up the menu. Go to System, and on the left hand side you have Networking, and you will see once you click there that you have an option called Enable Advanced Combat Logging. You tick that, and all that info will be compiled in a neat little text file, which you can find in your WoW folder. When you are about to raid or do a dungeon, before you start, you have to tell the game to start logging your shit. If you have the Radar.io add-on installed, by default it has an option where it starts and stops logging whenever you raid or do M+. If not, simply type in chat or make a macro that says /combat-log, and when you type it, you will see a message in chat saying combat being logged to logs/WoW-combat-log. And if you type it again, it will say combat logging disabled. You can do this for every boss or dungeon you want to keep track of, or simply have it automated with add-ons like Radar.io. And ideally, when you are logging in dungeons, don't stop logging until the end and only start before, to make sure that the actual file that it creates encompasses all of the things that you do in the dungeon. Once you are done with your dungeon or raid, you can go to your WoW folder, go to Retail and the Logs folder. In it, you may have a bunch of shit, but what you are interested in is the WoW Combat Log text file, which will either be named that or WoW Combat Log dash whatever number. With this, you can go to the application that you installed earlier and click the Upload Log option on the screen. If the app tells you to set up more shit, do so, since you will only do this for the first time only. Once you have selected your logs text file, hit go and wait for the magic to happen. When the log has finished uploading, you can click View Report to actually open it up and study it. You can and should delete the local file. You'll have an option in the app, since logs tend to be pretty large files and can take up some space on your PC. And with that, you have your first log. But how does it all work? Well, let's talk about a few basic things you can look for in a log, at least to start with. You may have heard of Parses before if you have ever been in a group with people tryharding. A simple way to think about Parses is to think of them as rankings. How good are you against everyone else playing your spec? Well, there are two Parses you will want to know of. First off, you have the number to the far left in the column under parse percentage sign. That number is the ranking of your spec with everyone in the world playing that very spec on that particular boss or dungeon. This broadly classifies you at how good you performed with your spec, and the higher the number, the better you are. If the number is 60, for example, it roughly means that you are better than 60% of the people playing your spec. But that's not as accurate as the next number you are interested in. On a raid log, you will see a column called eye level percentage sign, and the number represents how good you are on your spec versus people playing your spec and being close in your eye level bracket. This more accurately represents your performance, since if you are, as an example, 200 eye level on normal difficulty Terragru, then it's very unlikely you will have a high or even medium parse, since the majority of people playing the game would be way higher eye level, meaning they would do way more damage even if they are supposedly worse at the spec than you. That performance is less convoluted when you look at eye level percentage or key percentage for dungeon logs, which essentially means how good you are at that spec for that particular key level in that particular dungeon. These two numbers will be the first indicators as to how good you performed. And yes, most if not all of this analysis you will be doing will be against your other logs, or at the very most against people playing the same spec in the same content. If you are a fire mage, there is no point comparing your parse with an unholy decay, since that will hardly mean shit. One thing you need to be aware when looking at parses is something called padding, which you may have heard of. Padding is when someone is doing extra damage that does not further the killing of the boss faster. And I am saying boss because this mainly happens in raids, since in dungeons everything you will ever damage needs to be damaged. But in raids you may have adds that don't need to be damaged because they don't need to die, or will heal to full regardless. Some people still do damage to those adds just to have a bigger number at the end of the raid and hence a better parse. Padding is not necessarily frowned upon, but does skew the rankings when people can do that, since it will be harder to judge players that actually want to understand their effective performance. There are not many encounters nowadays where you can pad, but every now and again you have stuff like, say, the last trash in Spires of Ascension, the Mossworn Lieutenants, or whatever, that you have to kill before Devos. If you pull more than one and you don't kill them all at once, the ones left over will heal to full, hence the damage you dealt to them is useless, hence you are padding. Another example are the rolling balls on Painsmith. You really only want to kill one ASAP so you can put as much damage into the boss. So if you just spread your AoE to as many balls as possible, you essentially waste damage on things that will not progress you through the fight, when instead you could have put that damage into the boss. You might have had lower overall damage, but the damage would have actually been effective DPS towards getting you the boss kill. There are exceptions to this that come when people understand their spec and can exploit padding with air quotes. As an example, you have elemental shamans who can spread flame shocks even to targets that don't need to be damaged. By doing this, elementals can use those extra flame shocks to proc more instant lava bursts, which they will funnel into the actual target that needs to be killed. There are specs that use extra targets that serve no purpose, being DPS down, to increase their effective single target damage output. Another example of this was Subrogue during Zool in BFA, and on Painsmith Balls scenario, a counterexample would be Rogues again that can use the balls to generate extra combo points that will be useful once they jump back on the boss. Another important aspect of the parses is how to essentially play them and be aware of other people doing the same. When I say playing the parses, I mean exploiting the means that will get you a good parse in the end. This is not padding. This can be anything from smart increases in your damage to your whole raid or party catering to your parse by using all of the buffs on you. Buffs like Power and Fusion are the best examples here. If you are an Unholy Decay with 240 eye level, perfect gear and stats, and you fight Sylvanas on Heroic, you will do, say, 8k DPS overall, as an example. Now let's say Joe Dickey has better friends than you or more money. He is also an unholy DK with 240 level, same gear as you, even the same skill as you, playing as perfectly as you are. Instead, Joe bribed his priest or priests with some proper copium, and now he gets about 6 power infusions throughout the fight and ends up with 10k DPS. Is Joe a better player than you? In this scenario, no. He is, however, better at playing the logs and getting a better parse. Same thing can apply to situations like Demologs in 9.0, where their damage scaled with their HP, so people had their raid pop rallying cries and other procs that gave them a boost to their HP just as they were bursting with their cooldowns. That type of scenario is very inefficient and only works when everyone is overgeared and they are playing the parses, since normally you save shit like rallying cry to help deal with mechanics, not to boost a warlock's damage. If this is the case, when you look at your parse, always remember that there is a very good chance someone at least as skilled as you has done this fight or dungeon and has had outside help to boost their damage. This is mainly so you don't judge yourself too harshly, but also to give you context when analyzing your parses. And of course, there are good ways of playing the parse, and that is when you're using your damage cooldowns smart. For instance, we can look at an example for Enhancement Shaman in Sardonathrius, which I have personally played. When the adds spawn, if you save your Stormkeeper and just use it on the big adds, you're gonna do a lot of burst damage that otherwise would be inaccessible if you just use your Stormkeeper on cooldown and not have it for when adds spawn. And this can be an example that you can take to all of the specs. If you're in a fight and you're supposed to do AoE, or your AoE rotation is in your single target, or your AoE cooldowns are part of your single target rotation, and you know that adds will spawn in a couple of seconds, 10 seconds, depending on the situation, sometimes it's just better to save those and just use them on the adds for the increase in damage. Another example is Sludge Fist. When he goes into the pillars, he takes double damage, essentially meaning that if you have a very hard hitting ability, hitting that ability when he is on the pillar, it would just mean as if you were hitting that ability twice. So it would essentially double the damage. If you have a cooldown that can match with those pillar phases, you can essentially have a DPS roughly saying double the amount that you would normally have if he wouldn't be hitting the pillars. At least the value of that specific cooldown will double in its, overall value. So that is what I mean when I say playing the parses. That's not padding, because the boss needs that damage to be put into him so that you can kill him and get the fat loot. Now that you know a bit more about parses, let's talk about the first thing to think about when trying to understand what to improve on, and that is cooldown usage and the fight duration. This part is usually why sections in our rotations for the guides might not be as complete, since we cannot know how long the boss fight will last for you. Let's use as an example Shadow Priest. With Shadow, you have Void Form on a 1.5 minute cooldown and Power Infusion on a 2 minute cooldown. In an ideal world, pairing them up together will give you the most amount of damage, but if you did that, you would have to either hold Void Form for 30 seconds every time, or Power Infusion for, I think, a minute, neither being ideal. So at least in a raid, this is where fight duration is important, and this is all hypothetical as an example to get you to understand what I'm trying to say. If the fight lasts 4 minutes and a half, then you can save up Void Form to cast it with Power Infusion every time. In 4.5 minutes, you can only really have time to cast 3 Void Forms. At minute 0, minute 1.5, and minute 3, since at the 4.5 minute mark, the fight would end even if you do end up casting Void Form. As such, you can pair the first Void Form with Power Infusion. The second one you can hold for 30 seconds and cast it at minute 2 with the second Power Infusion, and the third you can hold for another 30 seconds and cast it at minute 4 with a third Power Infusion. This is a very sketchy example, since hardly ever a fight lasts exactly 4.5 minutes, but it does point out how to align your cooldowns with how long your fight lasts, so you can get the most amount of damage in that time frame without losing a cast of either cooldown. And this is the most important part, because this changes for other specs all the time. Specs like Unholy Decay that constantly reduce their cooldown by playing the specs, so sometimes holding them is not the best ideal, but obviously you need to know this and adapt it to your spec. And of course, Bloodlust comes into the discussion as well. When your group uses Bloodlust should dictate when you would ideally want to use your cooldowns. One last thing you can do is to get a better understanding of your buffs and cooldowns. I mean, there's a lot more stuff you can do, but this video has to fucking end at some point, and we can always dive deeper into the future videos and more about logging. Go to one of your logs you have made, click on your name, and then click on the buffs tab at the top. This is where you can see stuff like Titanic Ocular Gland, which is a good example of what you want to manage and take note of. This trinket is incredibly strong if you can keep its buff up, and as you may know, if your HP drops, so does the buff, and not only does it drop, it will take away stats. When you have trinkets, cooldowns, procs, anything really that's supposed to give you a buff you want to keep as much as possible, then this is where you can see it. For Beastmaster Hunters, for example, you can see stuff like Frenzy Uptime, for Fury Warriors, Enrage Uptime, and the list goes on. And of course, since we talked about cooldowns and fight duration, this is where you can see if you cast your shit enough. Instead of buffs, select casts as the tab of choice at the top, and you can look at everything in your rotation that you casted throughout the run. This comes into play in both raids and dungeons. If you see a fight lasts 7 minutes, and you have 2-minute cooldowns, then you should have 4 casts of those cooldowns made. Same thing with the dungeon. If a dungeon lasts 35 minutes and you play a Destrolock, for example, then you should have around 11 to 12 casts of Infernal. And if not, then you need to understand why. Is it because you saved it for a more important phase or a more important burst? Is it because you just forgot? This is where you start to work on the little things that will contribute to your overall damage, overall performance, and mastering of the spec in respective content. This sums up some of the basics when going into logs, and there's a lot more things that we wanted to touch upon and we just didn't have enough times. Stuff like how to look at the timeline of your rotation to know if you're popping your cooldowns right or if you're opening on the boss right, and how to see when other people do this better, how to compare your performance on a boss, let's say in a raid, against other people playing your spec in the exact same range of eye level or time duration for the boss fight or raid size and stuff like that. This is all really cool, and we can have an advanced version of the DPS logs analysis with a lot more stuff to get you started into improving your DPS, because all of this is great, but you need to understand exactly what you're looking at, and this is where we recommend you check the class discords. Class discords for pretty much all of the specs in the game do a really good job of being very, very helpful and analyze your logs. So if you don't really know what to look for, you can always go there and ask around and see what they have to say, since pretty much all of the information regarding logs and a lot of help that we've had to put this video together has come from a lot of the theory crafters out there for pretty much all of the specs. So thank you guys for supporting us. Thank you for giving us more details about the logs, and we'll definitely do more in depth, because we know there's a lot more to talk about logs that no one video will ever be enough to cover all of it. Another good point to make is to start using WoW Analyzer for as long as it's going to be updated. WoWanalyzer.com is a website where you can copy your log and paste in, and you can look at a basically conclusion of your performance. Some things might not be up to date since not all of the specs are being updated, but a few things that you can look at that will definitely be relevant for you is resource management, to see if you've capped Rage or Fury or whatever, and to see if you've missed casting cooldowns. We talked about the fight duration and analyzing how many cooldowns you could have casted during that time. On WoW Analyzer, you can just get a really quick answer as like, you've missed 2 infernal casts through that fight, and those are easy things for you to work on before getting into the more advanced bits. So WoW Analyzer is a really good source for you to manage those very simple things. And of course, very important, like we mentioned earlier, you need to get context for your logs. Why is your parse small? Why is your parse high? Is it because you're bad? Is it because you've gotten a lot of power infusions or didn't get a lot of power infusions? That's very important to understand exactly why that is, and especially when fights have a lot of mobility and you cannot stay on the boss as much. That comes into play into your log. So you have to take that into consideration when thinking like, oh, I could have used a cooldown here, but the boss was untouchable, like Painsmith when he transitioned, so I couldn't use it. That was, you know, out of my control. That type of context is very important when analyzing your logs, and that differs from encounter to encounter. And the last thing to mention is that there is always something for you to improve. Sure, you can be the most perfect player in the world, and even the most perfect players in the world will make mistakes here and there. There's always something they can improve. So always try to be better if you want more damage, and that's a good mentality to have. Thank you for watching the video. Hope it was helpful, and thank you to our patrons for supporting the content that we do. All of the new changes and all the new cool videos that we can do are no small part thanks to you. Thank you. And if you, the viewer, found this helpful and you want to support us a bit more, the link to our Patreon page is down below. Thank you everybody in the Discord community. See you next time.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.